All right. Hey, welcome back, everyone. We're back with another episode of ShiftED podcast. Today I'm staying local. I love when I can gather in some local experts. I have two amazing educators from Westerby Pearson School Board, Devon Warnock and Jennifer Mercer. And today we're going to really talk about differentiation, inclusivity. They are both let me get this right. Consultants in inclusive education. Those are your titles, correct, guys?
You got
That's
it.
right.
I love it. I came across that acronym CIE and I was like, CIE, CIE. I couldn't. And then I found it and I was like, yes, of course. Um, so before we start delving into our topic today, I'd love to kind of just set the stage a little bit. And Jennifer, why don't we start with you? How did you get to this stage in your career? I tend to ask, like, were there moments that you recall that brought you to where you are today that were very transformational in getting you to this spot in your career?
Wow, that's a deep question, Chris. I haven't thought too much about this, but I can tell you that I spent the majority of my career at a school in the east of our school board. I got hired at Verdun Elementary School right out of
Mhm.
university. It was my first experience working in a school. And it turns out that at that school, there were a lot of needs at the time. But of course, not having much to compare it to, I didn't really know any different. I did know that I loved the students. I knew I loved the team that I worked with. And that's sort of what kept me going back there year after year. And I actually spent my entire career before becoming a consultant at that school, which is sort of rare. A lot of people bounce around, but I was lucky enough to be able to get hired after a few rounds on the priority list, but not too many. And I got hired there, and there were diverse learning profiles in every single class there. And we just sort of adapted without even knowing any better at the time.
Right.
We just sort of did what we had to do. And it
Mm.
wasn't until, um, I've now become, now I've started working with a lot of different teachers in this new role. I realize that not all schools have that situation, right? There's
Right. Right.
still needs are changing throughout the system. There's definitely more diverse profiles in all of our schools now than what there were. But I'm realizing that the reality of teachers was not necessarily my reality.
Right.
And in our
Mm.
in our school board, typically consultants for inclusive education were resource teachers that have become consultants. But in my situation, I was a classroom teacher.
Mm.
But because I had so many diverse profiles and lots of IEPs, it wasn't too difficult of a transition for me to move over to this role because I was familiar with those things.
Right. I'm sure that lived experience too brings a plethora of wealth to the team as well, of having experienced the classroom and the firsthand connections with the students that way.
For sure. I think at the beginning, when I first moved into this role, that was definitely a plus for me. I did have that classroom experience. So when I was building my relationships with my teachers that I was working with, I think, that helped me relate to them
Hmm.
a little bit
Hmm.
better than maybe if I was coming from a different role.
Right.
But I've been now a consultant for the past 4.5 years and,
Mm.
learning every day. And I just love it.
Amazing. Awesome. And Devin, what about you? Where it all began for you? What were some of those tipping points in your career so far?
So it's funny because we often joke in our team. So both Jen and I worked in Verdun together, and our
Mm.
director, Sandra Luther, was our resource teacher when we were there, and she's now our director of student services. So all of the greats maybe come from Verdun because of the amount of kids that we had in front of us who
Mm.
required a significant amount of support.
Right.
And like Jen said, we didn't even know it was not normal. Like we were
Mm.
just doing what we had to do to ensure that those kids felt successful and felt engaged and that they weren't isolated. And so, back in the day, I remember I was teaching grade 6, and a tipping point, I think, for me is I was creating, adapted version 1, adapted version 2, modified version A, modified version B, and Sandra was running in my room taking half my kids out because there wasn't class sizes at the time. I had 28 kids, and I had 17 IEPs, and so we were just running rampant, and just that complete overwhelming sense of this is too hard. And so we had started to shift our practice back then, really looking through a trauma lens, and then looking at through a kid-centered approach. Like, what if we did stations? What if we did centers? What if we did daily 5? And that really changed our way of looking at how we adapted our environment to the kids in front of us.
Right.
So that was kind of my first little tipping point. And then, unlike Jen, I was on the priority list. So I hopped around from school to school, and I saw, like Jen said, some of these schools had one kid who was, a bit different. And it was really hard for those schools to adapt their teaching practices. It was like, well, this kid doesn't learn the way I teach. And it's like, okay, but maybe we can just try it differently, or they can show you a different way of how they learn. And it was really, really hard for those teachers to take that leap, to change, or to see that kid as a little bit, different. So I think that kind of really prompted me to start thinking about how I can help other teachers to see those kids in different ways, or to offer them different pathways to how they can learn. And when I came back from my mat leave, this post popped up, and actually I had reached out to Jen to say, hey, this post popped up, and I had been a resource teacher, I had been a classroom teacher, and she was the one who really encouraged me to apply, and it's just been great. I mean, the first year of consulting was getting the lay of the land, getting to know my schools, building those relationships, just like you would do within a classroom. But now it's, really building those relationships and seeing that what teachers need and how we can help. Because I remember feeling the frustration of a classroom teacher, like, nobody's helping me. I need help.
Right.
So it's kind of, it's allowed us to kind of branch out and to help develop others, because that's really where we see the biggest benefit, is that building capacity.
Absolutely. And I love the community too. I mean, not just within Lester B, but across our province. There's such it seems like a great team of people coming together with this purpose of making sure that all kids have access in classrooms. And it's not just those that, can or can't, or it's like really everyone has a fair shot at it. And it kind of brings me to this question. How long have we had inclusive classrooms here in Quebec? Has that been something that has been around for a long time, or is it something relatively, within the last decade that's happened?
I think it all depends on the school board that you're working for. Lester B has been inclusive since about 2003, 2004, if I recall. My very first year at Woodland School, which then became Verdun Elementary, we had, that was the very last year that they had closed special education classes. We had merged, the English school boards had merged, and then it was decided that Lester B would become an inclusive school board. So they phased out the special education classes shortly after. Some school boards still offer special education classes at certain levels, perhaps for different types of disabilities. But I think most of the English school boards do show an inclusive model to a certain extent. And the French system, I believe, still has many closed classrooms.
Right. And Devon, what's the thinking behind that? Like, why have inclusive classrooms? Like, what are the benefits for it for the students themselves?
I think that's a question that a lot of teachers have been asking themselves recently, because we've seen an influx of kids coming in with higher needs than ever before. And it's really become a question of, like, reminding ourselves of why we do this. And I always think back to Dr. Shelley Moore. She's a Canadian advocate for kids with exceptionalities. And she always brings it back to, back in the day, if you had any exceptionality, if you had any disability, not only were you not allowed in the school, you were sent to a completely different region. So siblings were sent to different schools based on their abilities. And it was only when parents really started to say, like, hey, wait a minute, why can't my kids go to school together? And they started to advocate for their children. And I think that's what we've seen in Quebec as well, is that we have these parents who are saying, hey, wait a sec. my kid deserves to go to school with his or her siblings, and they need to, be not only integrated but celebrated and have that real deep sense of belonging. And I think there's so many benefits to having inclusive classrooms and to having students working together, learning from each other, because it really sets the tone for human nature in general. Like when our kids are on field trips and they see people who may act differently or be in have reduced mobility, they're not surprised by that because they're going to schools with kiddos that looked and act differently than them, and that's okay. We celebrate it, and it's not just about tolerance, it's about acceptance. And I think that makes a big difference. And I think the biggest benefit that you can see is when you walk into our classrooms and see our kids, working together and not really seeing those differences, but really focusing on the similarities that they share. So, I mean, I know it comes with its struggles. We are definitely not in a perfect situation, but at the end of the day, I think it's the best environment for our kids to learn in.
Right. Absolutely. So, I mean, then in walks differentiation, right? Like having inclusive classrooms means that the teacher has to be aware of all the different varieties of kids they have, and then making sure they have access to the learning that's going on. How do you find that across the province of Quebec that the differentiation documentation that's been put out by the MEQ, that's understood and followed? Or does every board kind of have its own flavor and reinterpretation? Like, are the 9 boards all kind of in isolation in their differentiation and it's not something that's global across the province? Jennifer, you want to
Yeah, I was just going to
one?
say,
Yeah.
I think it's hard for us to speak about different boards, right? Because we've both been with Lester B for a long time. But what I do know is that, teachers, when they first get out of university, we study the curriculum, we study all the documents from the MEQ. And then as we get more and more comfortable with our curriculum, we get into habits, we get into routines, and we start to do things, sometimes the way we've always done things the year before, sometimes we make some tweaks. And what I have noticed is that there are some really great documents put out by the MEQ, and I'm not so sure teachers are remembering to look at them. Or also they're just so busy, right? So it's hard to sit down at the end of the day and spark up your computer and go see what the MEQ has to say, because you're putting out 10 fires every 5 minutes. So I think part of our job for Devon and I is to remind teachers also to go consult those documents. There's some great documents on flexible pedagogy and adaptations, modifications, as well as the curriculum documents as well when you're talking about evaluation. So I do think we get into old habits. We forget to look at those things, but they're really great resources.
And I think that's kind of why we did this, or why I thought to do this project, and then it bloomed into something a lot bigger. But there's a real misunderstanding of what's the difference between flexible pedagogy, differentiation, adaptation, modification. And we had teachers who were 15 years into their, like, not early career teachers, but 15 years in, who were unsure of what to do when they had a kid who was learning differently. And it's like, wait a minute, you've been doing this for 15 years and you still struggle. So something is not clear. So how about we kind of clarify certain things to help those teachers feel confident? Because that's the hardest part. And I think that's one of the struggles that we see. The minute that we don't feel confident, we don't really want to do it. It's you get in that gray area and you want to stick to what you know, and it's hard when we don't have the strategies or the confidence to be able to teach the kids that are sitting in front of us. And so referring to those documents are important, but like any good political ministry document, they're often vague, right? So they can they can be interpreted in many different ways. So I think that the beauty of those documents is that our teachers do have a lot of autonomy in what they do. But when it gets down to the nitty gritty of it and helping our kids who are diverse, we need to ensure that we're giving them the best practices that we can to make sure that they're successful.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's getting into the nuts and bolts of it all, right? Like, I've had many discussions with many a teacher about the understanding of what differentiation is and pedagogical flexibility, but when it gets to the brass tacks of it all, it's like, all right, where do I start? What do I
Yeah.
do? Do I have to make a lesson for every kid? And
Yeah.
like it's that surface understanding. So I understand, Devon, that you applied for a PDIG. Oh, remember,
Yeah.
teacher, PDIGs are opening up now, so you can apply for them for next year. And your PDIG was around an inclusive toolkit. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it was funny. I had gone to a presentation, and one of the consultants from Sir Wilfrid Laurier had done a similar project. And so I was like, oh my gosh, we need to do this at our board because we have so many amazing teachers. And, I think we need to kind of sit down and figure this out all together. And so I applied for a PDIG. We got it. It was amazing. We sat down with a boatload of teachers and we sent a survey out. And we originally called our toolkit the modification toolkit. And the aim was to make modifications more meaningful. And what we quickly realized is that by pegging it as a modification toolkit, that some teachers who didn't necessarily have kids who were modified in their class were like, oh, I don't need this. And
Right.
so they weren't necessarily being engaged in our professional development or our workshops. And I was like, wait a minute, like these are the teachers who need to hear this because these are the kids who are going to benefit from this, even if they're not modified. So we switched it up and we called it our inclusion toolkit because really it's how to how to do everything you need to do in an inclusive classroom. And that PDIG opportunity, I mean, man, sitting with those teachers. And one thing I think Jen and I have both learned very quickly in the role of consultant is that teachers will listen to teachers a heck of a lot faster than they will to a consultant because
Right.
even though we were teachers, we know how they felt. We are no longer teachers. We are now at the board level, and there's that shift in like, oh yeah, okay. But when it comes from their colleagues, man, what a difference it makes. So
Yeah.
hearing from them and really working closely with those teachers, it made it so much more meaningful for us.
Interesting. And Jen, can you elaborate on some of the like through work with the toolkit and where I guess it's more explicit and more strategy based and practice and like what were some of your surprises that you saw teachers wanting to adapt that they hadn't before?
Well, I think the beauty of this toolkit that was led by Devon and a colleague of ours, Jessica, worked on by a bunch of teachers. I think the beauty of this kit is that it's really a one-stop shop for
Mm,
teachers for planning for their classrooms. There are forms that they can use to fill out student profiles. They can have access to ministry documents. They can have access to some frequently asked questions, which is a section that I love in that
mm,
toolkit because it really does clarify the role of the teacher, the purpose of this toolkit. So there's a lot of really great things included, and I think it just really helps teachers to plan for their class,
mm,
plan for all of the needs of all of their students in a one-stop shop. It's not retrofitting for kids that learn a little bit different. It really is planning with everybody in mind. So I think that's the beautiful part of that toolkit.
amazing. Devon, do you have anything to add to that? Because I knew that you were behind it a lot of the toolkit. Were there any surprises for you that came out of that PDIG and working with teachers directly?
So I think what was fun about working with that gang was they weren't afraid to speak up and speak out. They
Mm,
had they asked some really hard questions. We sent a survey to our teachers. We got about 250-ish responses back.
mm,
And what we found in right away is it's teachers were really struggling with aligning modified activities with cycle expectations. Teachers were struggling with developing learning activities and then creating and reporting on IEP objectives, which, some of these teachers had been in schools for 15 to 20 years and they were still
mm.
struggling with those three things. So
Right, right.
it made us kind of look at our project as, you know, bigger than we had originally thought, which was great, because traditionally modification is really seen as other. right? It's
Right.
seen as
Right.
something different. It focuses on what kids can't do. And so we really wanted it to stop being a reactive approach for teachers. We wanted it to be something, well, like, how about we focus on what your kids can do
Mm.
and shift them towards bridging the gap in their learning wherever they are in their learning. And as opposed to what I did back in the day, of creating completely different materials and different assignments, it's how can you do this for all your kids so that you're not completely overwhelmed by who's sitting in front of you.
Mm.
And it is really just inviting, I think, teachers to think about all of their students when they're planning, as opposed to the kid who's easy to teach to.
Right.
So I think that's what we did. And it's still a journey. There's still some bumps along the way to go, but really that was the surprising thing. We had teachers asking really hard questions and really being vulnerable in what they didn't know. and
Right.
and it was like, wow,
Mm.
okay, so then if this many people need this much information, like let's see what we can do with this. So that was really
Absolutely.
the beauty of it, I think.
That's cool. That's cool. I really love that. Um, and I've also seen that you guys are starting to um start the journey at the pre-service teacher level. And I've
Hmm.
seen a couple of your presentations to pre-service teachers to get them ready, because
Oh
I've been
man,
doing
that's
work
my,
with them as
oh yeah.
well. And there's a long way to go.
Yeah,
So that after 15 years of practice, I'm only just starting, like, we want to avoid that, right?
exactly.
So what are the things that you guys recommend for those pre-service teachers that they should become aware of or read over, or like, how do you motivate them to be aware of inclusivity in our classrooms so that they're aware of it and react to it?
That is actually one of the best parts of our job. I think Devon
Mm.
would agree when we get to work with these brand new teachers. Devon and I have been part of a dossier with our good colleague Jacqueline, where we provide some professional development for teachers that are under the mentoring program. So, 0 to 5 years of service. And one of the PDs that we just recently did with them was sort of having them practice and planning with these students in mind, and giving them access to the toolkit and giving them hands-on experience to sort of tweak some lessons of theirs, using the tools that we're introducing to them. But I have to say, they have a lot of great tools already in their tool belt. They have what they have going for them, I think, is really sort of maybe a naivete, right? They don't really have a preconceived notion of what their classroom should look like, because they're just happy to pick up a 50% post that's left over, right? Because they're brand new. And when you look at who was in our session back in January, we had about, I would say, a good 30 students, sorry, 30
Teachers.
30
Mhm.
teachers, new teachers. And they all were teaching bits and pieces of things. 50% French grade 2, 50%
Mm.
French grade 6. And they were just happy to be there. They were overwhelmed, but they were happy to be there, and they were happy to work hard and meet the needs of their students. So they really
Mm.
do have some resilience, and they were happy to be introduced to these tools. But
Mm.
I think coming in fresh like that is really a great almost a protective factor, because they don't really know what
Right.
things should look like, because things
Right.
don't look like that anymore. Our students have
Mhm.
changed over the years.
Mm.
Classrooms are diverse. So I think their open-mindedness is really a great thing.
That's cool.
And
That's cool.
it's
Yeah.
I'm actually going to McGill next week. We're presenting at a class at McGill with Sam Bersesi,
Mm.
and we presented at Concordia a few weeks ago. That was amazing. But pre-service teachers, I mean, this is my bread and butter. This is where I want to
Mm.
be, because I know that the reality of teaching is so different than what you experience at McGill and Concordia, right? And I think
Yeah.
my recent research was that I think McGill maybe offers 6 to 9 credits that goes around somewhere inclusion.
Mm.
I think Concordia does a bit more, maybe 9 to 12 credits. Bishops, I think it was 6 credits. Those are
Mm.
the classes that are aimed at preparing pre-service teachers for inclusive classrooms. Sorry,
Mm.
and
So
the
it's not a lot of
reality.
exposure, really.
they're not really getting that exposure.
Mm,
And at the end of the day, designing for diversity is what you have to do.
mm,
So I think that a lot of our work goes into providing them with some skills and strategies that they haven't necessarily seen before.
mm,
And so then, in the minute you do that, they sometimes see that as extra. And so to
right.
avoid that, if we could get some coursework involved, some stuff, for them to have access to before becoming a full-time teacher and seeing it as an extra,
Right.
that's where we'll get the most bang for our buck. Because what we've learned and what I learned as a teacher is that if I can design for, one lesson for all my kids, I am saving 10 hours at night,
Yeah.
going home at night. And back before the internet, well, I had the internet, but I didn't have Google. So I would have to
Mm.
cut things out and cut it with glue and then photocopy it this way and not that way. And you spend hours doing that stuff.
Mm.
So, and we know that teachers lack that time and they lack
Yeah.
that, sometimes they lack support and resources. If you're in a school, in a rural school, you may not have a full-time resource teacher at your school. You may not have a consultant to come in and work with you. So if
Mm.
we can provide pre-service teachers and early career teachers with mentoring opportunities and opportunities to ask questions and to practice, I think that can really service us all in the long run, because then it becomes, our school boards are receiving these bright-eyed and bushy-tailed teachers, and within 5 years we can lose them because
Exactly.
they're overwhelmed and they're tired and they don't feel equipped to help to
Right.
teach a child with autism. They don't feel equipped to teach a child who has a specific learning disability in reading and writing. They've never had to do that before.
Mm.
So I think the more that we can prepare them, I think the higher chance that we'll keep them around.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you on that because it is overwhelming. I mean, just remove inclusivity, which is ridiculous, but just the teaching job is so overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And then having to take into account the kids in front. You can't just be up on the stage and just deliver stuff anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're getting half the kids. The other half are just
Yeah.
rolling their eyes like, what the heck am I doing here?
Yeah.
Um, this has been really fascinating. I want to thank you guys first before I have one last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What is the ideal inclusive environment in your opinions? I saw that there was an article, a post put out on through Lester B's newscast, and it talked about that. And that phrase, that sentence really popped out at me. What are some of the aspects that need to be in there? I mean, ideal is a big word, but an inclusive classroom that is more inclusive. Like if you're starting from very low, what are some of the things that are easy to get going to start creating that inclusion within your class? Jen, you want to?
Routines and
Oh,
rituals.
Devon. Say again,
Yeah.
Devon. Yeah, say again.
Routines and rituals.
Hmm.
If you can get a solid routine and ritual so your kids don't have to think about how to learn, if they
Hmm.
already know the way that you're going to teach. I know, Jen, when you always refer back to the setup that you had, your kids didn't have to think about it, they knew.
Hmm.
Yeah, lots of, routines, rituals that certainly helps build the class culture.
Yep.
I also think that, shifting the language a little bit.
Hmm.
I like that, we call ourselves consultants for inclusive education instead of, special education
Right.
consultants. I do like that, but even more so, if anybody follows Shelley Moore, she has a diagram where she's got these bubbles that represent, segregation and integration and inclusion. And she sort of challenges us to think about what's beyond that. What is beyond
Hmm.
inclusion, right? Because
Hmm.
when you look at your classroom, everybody is individual and everybody has different needs. And I think that's sort of whether it be behavioral needs, whether it be learning needs, whether it be everybody is diverse. So I think it's sort of just kind of shifting our lens from what's normal to have in a
Hmm.
class, quote unquote, to
Hmm.
just, acknowledging that everybody's unique, everybody has needs. And, just keeping that in mind when we plan for them, I think really, really will help teachers sort of grasp the needs of their class and be able to plan for those kids, and not just the one or two or four or five that have, learning difficulties or behavior difficulties, but just keeping everyone in mind, which is a challenge. And it can be overwhelming, but hopefully, through PD and through listening to podcasts and all of those things, we'll get there.
And I think at the end of the day, a real sense of inclusion in a classroom is that it's more than just a shared space. It's more than just routine and rituals. It's having those relationships that are solidly built where a kid feels that they belong in your class. Because the minute a kid feels they belong, you can get them to do anything. So that when you have that heightened sense, then students, whether they have exceptionalities or not, they're more likely to engage. They're more likely to contribute and to form positive relationships with their peers, which then, promotes a stronger community in your class. And because, the flip side is that when you have an inclusive school that don't have inclusive instructional practices, you have kids who are, throwing stuff at you and walking out of the class and are like, this is too hard. This is not for me. Right. And so you have, on the flip side is you have kids who don't feel that they belong, that know they aren't planned for. So I think when you build in those rituals, routines, and have that relationship and, use an inclusive framework, anyone in Quebec has access to our toolkit. They can go and check out all the templates and lesson plans that we've created, and really it's just an invitation to use a master brain of a teacher on paper. And that's kind of what we discovered. I think it was Arla Connell. She's a teacher for Maple Grove. She's fantastic. And she said, this is what excellent teachers do, but imagine we're just giving this to brand new teachers. Like they're going to have this in their minds, and then it's just going to become a ritual and a routine for them, a habitual thing to be like, okay, I'm planning this method. What's my baseline? Okay, what can all of my kids do? What could some of my kids do? And look at it that way. So
I like that.
Yeah,
that you can see it as kind of a structure that you're bringing in, and you're following that structure. I love the idea too, relationships. I mean, I think that's what educators do, is they create relationships with others, and hopefully positive, the most part, positive relationships, because once you have those, then there's room to move and to know. And sometimes you're going to get feedback from the student themselves of how they learn or what they're not getting at, or so totally love that. Totally love that. Well, guys, this has been really fascinating. You've made us all smarter out there, the listeners, because it is so important, and it just needs to be talked about more. Like I love too the idea of the language, that we just need to have a common language that we start using to set up some of these rituals and routines. So thank you guys for this. It's been really fascinating.
Well, it's been
Thank you, Chris.